Okay, I think we'll make a start. The number of participants seems to have sort of stabilized. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion on Europe's response to refugees, breakthrough or dead end. The immediate impulse for holding this panel discussion is the fantastic long read that Anna Valianatu wrote for us a couple of months ago, called Lesvos, How EU Asylum Policy Created a Refugee Prison in Paradise. It's a fantastic read if you haven't already looked at it, and maybe Rudy, you could post a link in the chat so that people can take a look at it if they haven't yet. What I think is great about it is that it starts out by looking at the situation on Lesvos itself, where Anna in fact is from. And so it's based on reporting on the ground, looking at the impact on people's lives in Lesvos, as well as the lives of asylum seekers themselves who are there. But then it kind of broadens out and discusses the way in which Lesvos is a kind of testing ground or laboratory, as Anna puts it in the piece, for broader changes that are taking place in EU asylum policy. And so she describes, for example, Greece as the gatekeeper of Fortress Europe. And it raises all kinds of really interesting questions, which hopefully we're going to get into in the next 90 minutes or so. But particularly striking, I think, is the way that it raises issues around human rights and the rule of law, which we're often told are European values, not least by EU officials, and yet I think there are real questions that Anna raises about whether the EU is actually living up to those values in its asylum policy. So Anna's going to kick us off in a little bit and tell us a little bit about about her research and what she found. And some of those questions that it raises about the EU's approach to asylum policy. And then we've got three kind of respondents, as it were, from very different perspectives. So we're going to start with Franz Lampelmayer, who's an advisor in the task force on migration management in the European Commission. And then we'll turn to Catherine Willard, who's the director of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. And then finally, Maciej Duvcek, who is a professor at the Center for Migration Research at Warsaw University. So let's begin with you, Anna. Tell us about your research on Lesbos and more broadly on EU asylum policy and what you found.
Thank you, Hans. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this always relevant discussion. I will briefly talk about my research on Lesbos, which, by the way, is the island where I grew up. So I'm personally and professionally invested in that border region. And I wanted to really understand how migration has transformed the life and politics on the island. Lesbos is unique, but it has also been used, as Hans said, as a laboratory for EU asylum policies. Some of these policies were first tested on Lesbos and then implemented in other border regions, such as the Canaries in Spain or the Polish border with Belarus. This is why it's been very useful to study the Lesbos case and draw some lessons from it. I guess that most of you know Lesbos from the refugee situation in 2015, when more than 1 million people traveled from Turkey to Europe through the island. The situation was unprecedented for Europe's standards and definitely for Lesbos standards too. The response was also unprecedented. There was an outpouring of support and solidarity by locals, civil society, and other European countries. This soon ended, as migration turned out to be one of the most politicized and divisive issues across the Union. Since 2016, European governments have not been able to agree internally on sharing responsibilities for refugees. As a result of this inability to reach consensus, the EU has obsessively tried to deflect and outsource or externalize, as we say in migration policy jargon, its asylum responsibilities outside of Europe to third countries. So it has struck deals with third countries such as Libya or Turkey in the case of Lesbos to prevent refugees from arriving. These agreements and cooperation are highly questionable from international and European law perspectives. And even though refugee crossings have gradually dropped since 2010, thousands of refugees and migrants still make the dangerous journey to Europe through the sea or the land borders, and hundreds of them die along the way. The EU-Turkey deal transformed Lesvos from a place of transit where asylum seekers would stop by on their way to Europe into a place of confinement. Asylum seekers are normally forced to stay on the island until their case is decided. Thousands of people have been trapped on Lesvos and in other Aegean islands, the so-called hotspots in EU asylum policy, acting as a buffer zone between Turkey and Europe or as refugee warehouses, according to the locals. More recently, the European Commission has funded and organized the construction of new mega camps on the islands, despite human rights concerns and protests by the local societies. This is part of the EU's increasingly hostile stance towards migrants and refugees. Asylum seekers are treated as security threats that need to be prevented from arriving in Europe at any cost. We use the term Fortress Europe to describe the policies and practices that take place in the name of security, with the aim to keep migrants away. This includes the hardening of border controls or even pushback operations performed illegally by various European countries, often with the help or tolerance of Frontex, the EU border agency. One of the most interesting findings of my research was that the role of EU agencies, such as Frontex or the EU Agency for Asylum, has significantly expanded through their deployment, first on Lesvos and then in other European borders. This has led to a deepening Europeanization in the areas of asylum and migration, which unfortunately is not accompanied by effective transparency and accountability mechanisms. Perhaps you've read about the ongoing investigations into Frontex. So on Lesvos, it's not clear who is in charge and can be held accountable for the implementation of asylum policies, as the European Commission, through its task force, and the EU agencies are actively involved in most aspects of border control, asylum processing, and so on. What's even more interesting or worrying is that existing EU asylum laws are not being respected by member states, nor enforced by the Commission. To the contrary, since the Commission's efforts for reform and the creation of a fairer responsibility sharing mechanism have ended in deadlock at the EU Council, the Commission has endorsed some very questionable national practices, such as the right to suspend protection for asylum seekers in situations of instrumentalization, like the emergency measures for Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia last year. So there is this paradox. The EU and its agencies are more and more involved in the implementation of asylum and migration policies, while at the same time, there has been a retreat of EU law and prioritization of national policies which are more restrictive and hostile to refugees and migrants. And of course, there is an even greater paradox, that of a liberal and rights-sensitive EU preventing asylum seekers from accessing the very protection they are entitled to and legitimizing human rights abuses. There is a big gap between political rhetoric, both at EU and national level, on the one hand, and what's happening on the ground on the other, particularly in border regions. And there is no accountability for this asylum and human rights violation. This is very problematic, not only because it undermines the fairness of the asylum system and respect for human rights, but also, as Hans said before, because it weakens the rule of law across the Union. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anna, for that overview. So, Franz, let's turn to you. Do you agree with Anna's critique, I suppose, of what's happening in Lesvos? And I should say you're in Lesvos right now, so you're literally on the ground as well. Do you agree with the sort of the story she's told about Lesvos itself, but also the broader critique, I suppose, of the sort of shift in the way that the EU has been approaching asylum? I guess sort of really going back to the refugee crisis in 2015, which in retrospect really starts to, I think, look like a critical juncture, not just for EU asylum policy, but I think in the evolution of the EU itself.
Thank you, Hans, and thank you, Anna, also for your presentation, and thanks to Chatham House to invite us also to this event, and for the opportunity also to discuss asylum and migration policy. I do agree with some of the analysis, but not with the conclusions, I must say. but I'll come to that later. I think, of course, we have all noticed that in recent weeks and months, the migration and asylum area is again at the center of attention in the public sphere in Europe and beyond, but mainly in Europe, of course. Some even say that we are witnessing the biggest migration crisis or movement since the Second World War. 5.3 million people have been entering the European Union in this year only, in the area of migration, so not as tourists, but as migrants. But of course, we also know that in this figure, the biggest number of 4.6 or so come from Ukraine, from a very specific situation. Of course, I don't want to minimize this as one of the migration flows that we have to deal with, but it's a very specific situation as well, and we will come to that later, I'm sure, also with Maciej and others intervening in that panel. First of all, I think it's important to also remind ourselves of the fact that the European Union has an asylum and migration policy. It has common procedures, it has common standards for reception, and it has also common rules on the status of beneficiaries. But we also know that in this whole acquis, as we call it, also in the European context of migration policy, of legislation, there are shortcomings, there are maybe not flaws, but there are things that function not well enough. Not to mention, for example, the secondary movements, absconding, and in principle, I think the basic line also that was mentioned already by Anna as well, it was not possible so far to agree amongst the member states of the European Union a mandatory system of relocation, of distribution of people seeking protection and asylum in the European Union. The pact proposals 2 years ago certainly are an attempt to respond to these bottlenecks and to this stalemate amongst the member states, and aims at the balance between solidarity and responsibility, and tries to give a response to all the aspects and all the sub areas of migration policy in a package approach. I don't want to go into details. I think most of those with us and in the panel also know that all too well. What we can say at this moment, at the beginning of December 2022, that the French presidency, but also the Czech presidency already have been able to achieve some progress in the negotiations in the legislative process. And also the co-legislator, the European Parliament, has progressed on that. And the aim of the European institutions, certainly of the Commission, is still to get to an adoption and agreement on the whole of the pact before the end of the mandate of the Parliament and the Commission. Now that we will see. Just in this context, a little warning also. I think it's also important to keep in mind when we discuss about asylum and migration that we need to be realistic. Migration policy is and has been a challenge, a big challenge for all of us, for institutions, for member states, for societies. So I would, referring to the title of the workshop, of the event, not expect any breakthrough, but also not a dead end. We also, I think, can say that despite all the shortcomings and bottlenecks that I mentioned at the political level, and also in the practice, in the implementation, the European Union was able to accommodate and give shelter to almost 6 million people since 2015. Many of those people have received the status of beneficiary of international protection. Many of them have been integrated, some of them really well. So there are good stories, success stories as well in all this context. So we should not always only look at the bad stories, but also on some of the results. Especially in Greece, even in Greece, and I can witness that because I've been working here on Lesvos for 2 years now. recently, in the recent months, half and half with Brussels, because I'm also dealing with Ukraine. With Maciej, we met last week in a meeting, as he said, as he mentioned before. For example, the backlog of asylum procedures, which was one of the key problems that we had in Greece since the start of the crisis back in 2015, was this huge backlog in asylum procedures, and the slow movement of these procedures, which resulted precisely in some of the issues that Anna mentioned in her presentation. That people had stayed long or had to stay long in camps like Moria, which were absolutely not up to European standards, and spent years waiting for the decision and for the second decision and so on and so forth. And this backlog, which was at 90,000 only 2 years ago, has been reduced now to 17,000, which is still too much, of course, but I think there is certainly some progress that we see. The task force that I am part of as an advisor to Mrs. Gminder, who is the head of the task force, Deputy Director General of DG Home, who is currently in Athens in other meetings, that's why she cannot join us today, was created actually following this horrible fires of Moria, and I can say that with the help of the task force, but not only, of course, with a lot of other actors and the UNHCR institutional actors as well, and member states who participated, we were able to, from day one, bring improvements to the first emergency camp and then to the temporary camp, which is still now running in waiting for the new camp to be open whenever it will be finished. Just to I have to contradict a few of the assertions made by Anna in her presentation. I think it's not true to say that we as a Commission, at least, or we as a European Union as such, we are testing new policies here. I mean, I think it's important to see that it sounds dramatic, but it's much less dramatic than this. This daily support of implementation of the policy is a role which is not an implementation of a new policy. We're in the current context. We have the current procedures. We're not inventing new ones. There were some interpretations of the pact proposal which thought that there were zones even without exterritorial zones established on the external borders, but this is not true. It's simply not true. This is Mavrovouni, as it is called now, the temporary camp. It's a reception center where people are housed now. All of them are housed in containers or refugee housing units and not in tents anymore. Thanks God, we managed to get rid of that last year. And according to European standards, to the EUAA standards, and are going through the procedures in a very normal way. We helped with funding, we helped with advice, but we are not doing that taking the responsibility of the Greek authorities. That's simply also not a fact. The fact is that the responsibility is very clear. We have not touched on that. We do not intend to touch on that. The European Commission has not proposed any change or any shift in competences. It's clearly the Greek state who is responsible for border control. We are not involved in that at all, and nor is Frontex, and also for the asylum procedures, for the reception and everything. What we as a task force are doing here actually is to observe and acting as the watchdog of the treaties. Actually, that's one of the roles of the Commission, to see if the policies are implemented, and in a more direct way also help highlight issues, and in weekly meetings and discussions with the authorities help them to find solutions. But we are not doing it. We're not acting as the state here. I know I'm a little bit over time. Just as a last minute, because as a last thing that I want to say here in my little introduction, because I'm sure we will come to other aspects that Anna presented later on. I think one thing is very, very important also to see. as has been said, migration and asylum policy is a very politicized and sensitive area for all of the member states, not only for Greece, but all the member states. We see that, and not only the member states, of course, also Schengen associated countries, whom we are very in close contact, and other countries, for simple reasons. And these reasons are also facts. We cannot just say there are excuses not to apply the acquis. The acquis is applied, and if it's not applied, we go to courts. We ask the member state to apply it, and we have a lot of tools to do that. But there are issues for each member state. For those on the front line, it's certainly a security issue, which is related to drugs, to trafficking human beings, to issues of hybrid warfare that we've seen, terror threats, and so on. So this is something that each member state has to take seriously, and we as a union have to take seriously. And for all other member states who are not on the external borders also, but also for those on the external borders, there is also an issue of public order and internal security, because you cannot have solidarity and you cannot have a responsibility and a policy if you don't take the people with you and have the society accepting it. We have seen it here in Lesvos, open arms 2015, 2016, still for quite a long time. And even now, I would say people are not anti-immigration. They are not anti-refugees at all. There might be always some kind of small minority politically in that corner that exists everywhere. But what really led also to these events of early 2020 and riots and very ugly scenes was this overcrowded situation and the inability of authorities and of Europe, let's say it as it is, to deal with the situation. So I think that is something we have to keep in mind. And of course, and ending by that, we are absolutely behind our pact proposals. But of course, overarchingly, I would say what is really needed beyond that, to really implement legal pathways of immigration, to avoid that people have to go on these kind of boats and risk their lives and pay a lot of money to the smugglers, and stop this kind of behavior. So I'll end here. Sorry to
Great. Thank you, Franz. That was great. So neither a breakthrough nor a dead end, you're saying, and I should say, you know, when we use that word breakthrough, we had in mind, I suppose, two senses of it, partly to do with the pact, which, you know, as Anna, I think, points out in her long piece, you know, was presented as a fresh start, right? So kind of as a breakthrough. But then the second kind of meaning of it is around the war in Ukraine, and this kind of hope that the war in Ukraine has led to a kind of a breakthrough in the way that we think about asylum within the EU. We'll come to that, you know, shortly, particularly with Professor Dušek. But before we get onto Ukraine, I wonder if I can just push you a little bit, Franz, on the sort of shift that has been taking place in EU asylum policy since you know, roughly the refugee crisis in 2015. Because, you know, Anna has, you know, in her piece and in her opening remarks, you know, said talked about some of the trends that she, you know, and others have identified. The externalization, you know, particularly since the EU-Turkey deal. Some people would also talk about sort of the securitization of this. But I wonder if you could just give us your perspective, Franz, from the Commission, on how the Commission itself thinks that its approach to EU asylum policy is evolving. As I say, before the war in Ukraine started, you know, for me, I have to say, one of the kind of symbols of this, the sort of the apparent shift in thinking on this, for me, is the way that, you know, since 2019, the Ursula von der Leyen Commission has a European Commissioner for promoting the European way of life, who is responsible for migration policy, which to me makes very explicit the idea that the EU sees migrants as a threat to the European way of life. That's how it looks to me, but what's your sense from within the European Commission on how EU asylum policy is evolving? Are you thinking about asylum policy in a different way than 10 years ago?
I would not subscribe to that. I think that shift is a little bit written and not promoted, but it's a narrative which is fed into by a lot of things and a lot of using a lot of elements. I think it applies to a certain extent to some member states, in the sense that some member states, take Italy, for example. They used to have a government which was very, very strict on migration, stopped any search and rescue if it was not done from the state, and so on. Then there came another government which was pursuing a different line. Now we're back to another government. We will see. It has not yet so much materialized, but we had already one row between France and Italy. But it's not the European Commission who is pursuing that. We are we are the watchdog of the treaty, first of all, and then also we have the right of proposal. So we made proposals, but I don't think that the pact proposal as such can be labeled externalization, can be labeled European way of life. This means that we are Fortress Europe. No, I don't see that in the text. I mean, if you look closely, if you read the text, it's proposals to ensure a controlled approach to migration, to asylum seekers. We have to make sure that asylum is not all the time confused with immigration. It seeks also it intends to propose some legal pathways, some legal ways to immigration. Some member states are following up on that now on a bilateral basis. But I agree with you. I mean, there are a lot of elements that could be interpreted in another way, but it's not the Commission proposals. It's what you do with it. I mean, it's like now. I mean, the asylum right is there. Of course, if you don't apply it, or if you apply it, you shorten some procedures which are enshrined in law, then you're not following up. You're changing the policy, but the policy itself, it's not the line of the Commission to make a Fortress Europe, no, and to externalize either. I mean, especially just the last sentence on that. The Turkey deal, I think it was hailed by many at the moment because there were high expectations that it would help us, and it was designed in a way that it would have helped much more than it did at least during two years. It worked more or less, but the numbers were much too low, of course. Why did it not work and not work better, and why is it not working now? Because it takes two to tango. I mean, it's as simple as that, unfortunately. And we are unfortunately surrounded by neighbors. We see it also with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, neighbors in the wider area also, who you cannot trust. You have to be very, very well prepared. You have to act in other ways than you are used to until 24th of February this year, unfortunately.
Great. So I'm sure we're going to come back to this issue of the sort of division of labour and responsibility between, the EU member states and so on, because this is one of the things that Anna does get into in the long piece. So I'm sure she'll have something to say about that. But maybe this leads us perfectly on to Catherine and this question of the sort of politicisation and the politics. We already have a question from someone about how the Meloni government will affect, Italy's approach and by extension the EU's approach. You work, Catherine, with, you run an NGO that works with refugees. Tell us how this looks from your perspective, and in particular how you think the politics of this are working.
So let me come in with on some of those points that you've mentioned. I will give a couple of comments on political thinking behind some of the approach described by Anna, and then a few comments on the use of law to resolve political conflicts, and then perhaps conclude with some of the future scenarios that we see. So from our perspective, we see that since 2016 and arguably before, one of the objectives of European policies on asylum is to limit the number of people seeking protection in the EU and also to limit the numbers granted protection. And these two factors are seen as linked because there is often a belief that making it harder to obtain protection will actually limit the numbers seeking protection, although that can be disputed, and I think the evidence tends to indicate that's not the case. This approach results from a whole set of different factors. One is that as has already been mentioned, one of the only areas on which agreement can be reached is on this question of limiting the arrivals of people, as well as on trying to rapidly return people. So this allows for agreement among geographically among the member states, which remain, of course, deeply divided on the questions of responsibility sharing within Europe. There we see the very tricky situation that there isn't enough support for the existing rules as set out in Dublin, but there's no agreement on what would replace Dublin. We also have the reality of the situation that no member states, except for arguably one, actually want to accept more refugees or to host more people than they do. And others range from being reluctant to accept people to being stridently anti-refugee in their policies and practices. And it's also possible to get agreement politically between the hardliners and the centre on an approach which is based on limiting the number of arrivals. And this is also partly because we hear from policymakers, but also at times from UNHCR, that the way to defend refugee protection is to remove from the system those who don't have protection needs. We find this actually to some extent a false argument, but I can come back to that in the debate. I think another political factor here is the tendency of the European Commission in recent years to define its role as doing what the member states want. And it was really refreshing to hear from Franz there, the emphasis on the role of the Commission being to defend the treaties. In our engagement with this commissioner and certainly with the last commission, what we heard frequently as a justification for proposals being put forward was, this is what the member states want. And our view there would be, well, it's not the role of the Commission to do what the member states want. It is the role, as referred to in the treaties, of defending the treaties amongst other roles. There has also been a tendency to deal with this issue in a crisis framing, and that is used to justify harsh measures. And that's something that Commissioner Johansson had tried to change, to her credit, already before events in Ukraine, seeking to normalize this policy issue, which we consider a very useful point. Finally, I think when it comes to the European Parliament, the Parliament has been a force resisting some of the more restrictive approaches, but that was stronger during the last parliamentary term because the Parliament was more united. There are two significant changes now. One is that the centre-right EPP group has become significantly more hardline. So getting a majority that is relatively supportive of the right to asylum, or indeed the EU being effective in this area, is more difficult because
Since when has that been, Catherine?
So in this parliament, so if we look at the parliament, this current parliament's mandate, there was a fear that there would be an increased presence of the far right. This didn't happen, but what we have instead is a more extremist positioning of the centre right, and it aligning more often with the far right than with the centrist and progressive groups. I would also say that Parliament is in some disarray at the moment because it's overloaded with legislative proposals. So the role it played before, I think, has been weakened. Let me move and conclude with my second point, which is on the role of legislative changes in all of this. So this strategy of trying to limit the numbers seeking protection in Europe is manifested in different ways. There are non-legislative measures, many Anna has described, but we also see, of course, the use of funding, operational support, informal cooperation, conditionality, explicit or implicit, in diplomatic, development and trade relations. And a certain, we would describe capture of external affairs to try to achieve some of this. But there are also legislative efforts to achieve some of these objectives. Our view has always been that the focus should be compliance on existing EU law. rather than legislative reform, with the exception of course, the Dublin regulation, where a fundamental reform is needed. But unfortunately, the reforms that have come in Dublin 4 and RAM, the regulation on asylum migration management, largely preserve the existing and problematic Dublin rules that, in our view, generate the dysfunctionality of the Dublin system. So better no reform than a bad reform. In any case, strong focus on compliance. So I was also very pleased to hear that emphasis from France on implementation. In our analysis, in our work, including the AIDA database, we've identified a series of implementation gaps when it comes to the Common European Asylum System, and urge the focus to be on tackling those implementation gaps rather than legislative reform. There are attempts, I think, to solve political conflicts through legislative reform, and this makes for bad law. And some of the proposals we see as unworkable, and they build in some of the irreconcilable positions of the member states. There are also within the 2016 reforms, a number of which remain on the table and in the pact, measures that we would view as trying to codify the model that Anna describes in her research. So a containment of people at borders, a use of tools like fiction of non-entry concept to restrict the protections people have, and above all, the use of different procedures to try to limit access to protection. So the use of inadmissibility procedures, 2016 proposals, they still remain in the regular procedure, but become optional in the border procedure. Then the use of border procedures, bringing together of asylum and return procedures, a certain erosion of the right to an effective remedy, etc. I won't go into the details. You can read our 500 pages of analysis on all of that if you want more. And I think there is also in those proposals an unfortunate reflection of certain member states' obsession with secondary movement. We prefer to use the term onward movement, and a concentration of increased responsibilities in the countries at the borders. Our view is that those kind of measures are likely actually to lead to pushbacks. If you focus on substandard border procedures, it doesn't make it more likely that you could rapidly get an asylum decision and rapidly return people. That makes it more likely that the country that has to create infrastructure at the border decides to engage in pushbacks. So let me conclude. The instrumentalization proposals also came in 2021, and in our view are the worst of the bunch, because they allow member states to derogate from EU law in quite a wide range of situations, which are described as instrumentalization, but the definition is so broad it's almost every situation at the border. And there's a sort of menu of derogations. We would consider it a move away from a common system. And then really my final point, the scenarios, what's likely to happen. The Ukraine response shows that a different approach is possible. There are immense practical challenges in response to displacement from Ukraine. It is an ongoing humanitarian emergency. This is clear, but the political decisions were correct. The role of the Commission, in our view, has been exemplary. That's not necessarily something that is often said from ECRE's side. And the decision to activate the TPD, of course, has made the difference. And in 2015, this didn't happen. And instead, we got the EU-Turkey deal. And then we got proposals that aim to codify some elements of that model. The opposite response has been one based on allowing access at borders, rapid access to protection, freedom of movement is no longer a taboo, and the content of protection is strong. There's now about a year and a half to either conclude the reform process in a way that does least damage and to learn from the Ukraine experience, which has to involve a review of proposals that actually often go in the opposite direction of that response. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Catherine. I want to come back to this question of reform later on. I also want to give Anna a chance to respond on this question of the relationship between the EU and member states, picking up on what Franz and Catherine has said. But in a way, the last thing you said there, Catherine, or one of the last things you said on Ukraine leads perfectly into Professor Duszek. So Poland, Professor Duszek has sort of come up implicitly. I don't think it's been mentioned explicitly, but it's come up actually a couple of times already in the discussion. Obviously, in 2015, Poland was one of the countries that was most opposed to accepting asylum seekers around that time, particularly from Afghanistan and Syria. There was this question of secondary or onward movements that has come back. Poland has been one of the countries pushing back on some of the proposals from the EU on those questions. But then, obviously, you know, since the war in Ukraine, you've seen this this very generous approach in Poland to people from Ukraine. And Catherine talked about, you know, this is an illustration that a different approach is possible. I guess my question would be, is it actually a different approach to 2015, or is it the same approach as the government, the Polish government took in 2015? It's just different types of people. So I wonder if you could sort of tell us your view on that, but also more broadly, give us your take on how all of this looks from Poland. Does it look very different than it does from Brussels or from Berlin or from London?
Thank you very much for this very nice invitation. And I was asked also to highlight two things, two issues, mainly the influx of war refugees from Ukraine, but also the situation, still the humanitarian crisis of the Polish-Belarusian border. But let me start by saying that I think so in the history of migration, Poland is the country that has been the fastest to change from the emigration country into emigration one. Because I think so we still have in our heads discussion after when we joined the European Union in 2004 and the huge wave of Polish immigrants who emigrated, especially to Great Britain or Ireland or Germany, but that now we have all of the characteristics of the typical immigration country, because the situation started to change in 2014. To be honest, after the annexation of Crimea, and with the influx of economic migrants from Ukraine, before 24 February. In Poland, there were more than 1.3 million of them living in our country. I think it is very, very important, very significant if we analyze the aid that has been given to war refugees from Ukraine, because as you can imagine, a lot of war refugees were welcome not only in Poland, but also joined the part of the families who stood in Poland before outbreak of the second part of the war between Ukraine and Russia. By the end of March, more than 2 million war refugees from Ukraine had arrived in Poland, but some of them treated, of course, Poland as the transit country. And after a very short period of stay, decided to leave Poland and to go to another countries like the Germany or Czech Republic, but also to Canada, where we have the very huge minority of Ukrainians. And I think that these departures were definitely the result of the very quick decision to activate the Temporary Protection Directive, because the decision was taken on 4th of March. And for me, it would be very difficult to imagine the situation if this decision would not be taken by the Council, because if we try to literally think about the Dublin and the Geneva Convention and Dublin regulation, it would be quite impossible to offer, for example, international protection from all Ukrainians who came to Poland. I think so. It is absolutely necessary to remind you that 70% of people who cross the European Union borders came to Poland or go via Poland to another countries, but still we are responsible for 70% of border crossing from Ukraine to European Union. And I think that decision to activate very fast activation of the Temporary Protection Directive was dictated by the failure of the response to the migration crisis in 2015. It has been already mentioned by previous speakers. Before mandatory relocation or procedure for granting the international protection to be honest, failed in practice because, for example, of course, the Poland was the one of the country who blocked this mandatory relocation with the another Visegrad countries, but still only 25% migrants have been relocated to the another countries. That's why, in my opinion, the mandatory relocation idea failed in 2015. But of course, at now, I can say if we think about the assistance to the war refugees from Ukraine, we can say that we have the common position. The only country opposing active assistance to Ukraine and Ukrainians is Hungary, from the political reason, of course. But at the same time, I think that we cannot overlook double standards in this context. This issue also has been mentioned before, because I'm really convinced that in a situation when in 2015 the European Commission would have proposed the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, many states, including, I think, so the Visegrad countries, including Poland, would have opposed this proposal. However, this issue should be raised in the discussion of the new Pact of Migration and Asylum, because as Anna, I can say, said that it is absolutely necessary to come back to the discussion about the broader activation of the Temporary Protection Directive in the future crisis, because today's crisis that's not the last one, of course. That's why we can expect in the future also the another different migration or humanitarian crises. This is quite obvious that we are facing now in Poland not only one crisis, but only two crises, because I have already mentioned the first one, the influx of Ukrainians who were refugees to Poland. But it is not the problem, I can say, how to cross the border, because it is not the problem concerning the crossing the Polish or Hungarian or Slovak border, but it is that we are facing now the problem how to integrate more than 1 million of war refugees in Poland, how we can treat them, because still 55% of them declared that maybe in the very short period of time will decide to come back to Ukraine. But you know, the situation is quite liquid, and it is quite impossible to predict what would happen in the very near future. But of course, it is my perception, I can say, that in the medium term, the war refugees may be replaced by the economic migrants. It will certainly be necessary at European level to propose a solution on how to help Ukraine rebuild their country, but also how to regulate labor migration from the country, so that both sides can benefit. Because we, as the Poles, we know it very well. It is the regulation of free movement of persons within free movement of workers within the European Union. It's very difficult to prepare proposal which will benefit both sides, because we can also speak to brain drain and brain waste and such migration phenomenon. That's why we should take into account that Ukraine will be in very difficult economic situation within the next years, not months. That's why it is absolutely necessary to try to provide to provide the proposal for Ukraine, how to keep them, of course, keep the relations, very strong relation with the European Union. But the second crisis, of course, concerns the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border. There we are still faced with the daily provocation, the Belarusian regime, which stimulates immigration to Belarus and then actively helps immigrants to cross the border. For example, today, the Polish border has published the new data, and only yesterday, 8 smugglers have been captured by the Polish borders. It means that we have still immigrants in the Polish forest, because without smugglers, without immigrants, we have also we don't have smugglers. And even if the Polish courts have already ruled several times that they are illegals, the pushbacks are illegal because the law adopted in Poland is contrary to international law, which Poland has ratified. Certainly, the situation at the border can still be called a humanitarian crisis. In practice, on the Polish-Belarusian border, we have the analogous situation to that on the Serbian-Hungarian, Greek-Turkish, Italian, Greek or Spanish borders. Of course, I will finish in 30 seconds, okay? Because this is, I have also, I think, so maybe I will mention later.
Come back to some of this later
Of course,
on, in the discussion.
But I think that it is absolutely necessary to say that the protection of the border against illegal crossing has become a pan-European challenge, so to speak. The question on how to maintain our European values, especially within the framework of fundamental human rights, while protecting our border and fulfilling our obligation under the Schengen Border Code, requires a very urgent response, also in the discussion on the new pact on migration and asylum. In my opinion, this is my last sentence, and I think so this is quite a strong sentence. In my opinion, this challenge and dilemma is highlighted by the problems currently facing the EU Frontex agency, because you have all of this issue, how to keep the basic human right, but also how to protect the borders. It is the problems about the future of Frontex agency. Thank you very much. Of course, if I can react in the later discussion, it will be very nice. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Professor Dubček. And yes, and maybe if we have time, we can come back to this question of the so-called weaponization of migration by Belarus and others. I do want to take some questions though, because we're running out of time. So do write your questions in the Q&A box, and then I'll put those questions to our panelists. Can I just push you though, Professor Dubček, on one thing, because you know, in a way we were sort of interested in sort of trying to understand what the Ukraine case tells us about the broader picture in terms of the EU's approach to asylum, and is this, you know, is it in some sense a new approach? You talked about the double standards, so you sort of recognize that there is this kind of inconsistency between the way that we treat certain types of refugees versus others. Can I just push you a little bit more on that? I mean, in the Polish case, it does, you know, to me as an outsider, it does look as if the contrast between the way that Poland reacted to, you know, non-white, non-Christian refugees, particularly from Syria and Afghanistan in 2015, and white Christian refugees from Ukraine in 2022, it does seem like a very, very, you know, big kind of contrast. What role does that that factor, you know, one might call it ethnic solidarity, play in the way that Poland approaches the refugee question?
I think that ethnic solidarity plays quite important role, of course, in our attitudes to the different types of migrants, the different types of refugees. But I think so this, you know, this is before outbreak of the war in 2004 February. Our relations with Ukraine was, I can say, quite difficult, because we have the different perception of our common history. That's why it was not so easy to predict that the reaction of Polish society would be so fantastic, I can say, because as you know, this is the 400,000 of refugees have been welcomed by the Polish families. Okay. But of course, I think that we have the common enemy, because the Russia is our common enemy. That's why we try to support as strongly as possible Ukraine and Ukrainians, because we try to win the war with Russia. We are our common enemy. That's why this is maybe one of the explanation. But yeah. I think so that we should also take into account the role of the public media, because after when this humanitarian crisis started on the Polish-Belarusian border, in Polish media, especially public media, who is pro-government, it was so many different information headlines and so on. This was we are on the attack, not by the Russia, but not only organized by the Lukashenko regime, but also by this Muslim who try to change our way of life, for example. And that's why this is still us, because I started my presentation to saying that we very fast shifted from the typical emigration to immigration country, because you know this is for 60% of Poles it would it was not very easy to understand the situation because they have never met the foreigners, the refugees, especially from Muslim countries. That's why it was quite easy to I can say to prepare this picture. You are on the attack, not from the only Belarusian regime, but also by the Muslim who try to change our way of life. But this is quite complicated. What is very interesting for me, that's when the journalists but also the expert asked me just after 24th of February how long, for example, this very positive attitudes there were refugees from Ukraine and will take place. I said maybe 2-3 months. But still, it is very interesting because the 85% of Poles still are in favor to help Ukrainian refugees. But on the other hand, 60% of them said it's too costly for us. As the people, as the country, but still 85% of Poles are in favor to help Ukrainian refugees. But also, this is also very important. This last sentence, the attitudes towards refugees from Muslim countries also improved during last months, not maybe dramatically, but still it is 10% more than, for example, the last year. It is positive. I think
so you're kind of saying it's ethnic solidarity, but it's an interesting kind of, or surprising kind of ethnic solidarity in a sense. Anna, I did want to come back to you on these questions of, because in a way, what Professor Duvček has just said in bringing in the media brings us back to this sort of question of who's responsible, right, for this sort of toxic kind of climate around asylum. And I think there's probably quite a lot of blame to go around. As I mentioned, it seems to me the European Commission, by having a European Commissioner for promoting the European way of life who's responsible for migration, is contributing actually to this kind of atmosphere. But let's come back to this question that came up earlier around the different kinds of responsibility and this tendency to buck passing that there tends to be in this area where, you know, member states blame the EU blames member states, we were hearing from Franz earlier on that the Commission, you know, has this tendency sometimes to do what member states tell it to do. How does this look from your perspective, Anna? Because you talked a bit about this in the paper, the sort of question of responsibility. And I know, Franz, you're going to, I misquoted you, but I'll give you a chance to come back in a second.
Yes, there's been a lot of discussion also from Catherine about it. So, you know, who decides, who does what? I think Lesvos, where France is currently on, is like a model for the joint pilot, right? The joint migration management, as the Commission calls it, or the joint implementation of asylum and migration policies. So definitely it's not like only, you know, the Commission who implements them. It's the primary responsibility belongs to the Greek state or to each member state, according to the division of labor between the EU and its member states. However, because there is like this model of joint implementation, the responsibilities and accountability hence is blurred. So who does what? Because the Commission is heavily involved in day-to-day management of the camp, as Franz knows, or the EU asylum agencies involved in the asylum processing, or Frontex is involved in border control, assisting the Greek Coast Guard. So in all of these different aspects of, let's say, asylum policy, in the wide sense, there is this interplay, this tango between the EU authorities and agencies on the one hand, and the national and local ones on the other. So it's not clear, as it came out during my interviews, including with local government or with local people as well, who is taking the political and social responsibility for it. And also there's no clear line of command. This, you know, when something goes wrong, or for example, when local societies disagree with the policy implemented from the top, from, you know, starting from the Commission and then implemented with the help of the Greek authorities, of course, then the EU authorities put the political blame on the Greek government or the non-compliance, for example, on cooperation by third countries, such as is what you said, Franz, before with Turkey. And on the other hand, the Greek authorities always say that we are forced to act like this. We're forced to build a new camp because of the EU, cooperation with Turkey, or because we are not receiving, for example, EU support from different angles and member states. So all I'm saying is that there is heavy involvement of the EU side, so it's very difficult in practical decision-making processes to distinguish who is to blame and who is to hold accountable.
Do you accept, Franz, that there is this kind of blurry picture in terms of responsibility? It strikes me that it's very similar actually to other policy areas. Like if you think back to the Euro crisis, who was responsible for imposing austerity on Greece? Was it Germany and member states, or was it the European Commission? Well, it was kind of both. And exactly as Anna was describing, there's a sort of complex way in which they kind of interact with each other. Is that not fair, Franz?
I think you brought a very good example to see what we are not doing in the field of migration, because it's exactly not the way it happened with the Euro crisis. There, I think the Commission, but also member states and International Monetary Fund and so on, the institutions as they were called here in Greece, went too far. For me personally, I absolutely would subscribe to that, because there the interference was at a level which was really very, very disputable. Whereas we do not have. But
Franz, you would have heard, I'm sure, people from the European Commission essentially saying, well, it's not our fault. We were just doing what the member states told us to do.
Well, I think we don't have time, and it's not exactly the place to discuss the role of the European Commission in the Euro crisis and what in this memorandum with Greece. I mean, all the sides made mistakes, I'm pretty sure, because also the Greek governments, the successive governments had different approaches and so on. But it's precisely different. What is different here in the sense. In the situation with the task force on migration management, because we do not have a troika, we do not have a permanent presence at the ministry and regular meetings where we tell the Greek authorities what to do. We don't do that either with Cyprus. We don't do it either with Spain or with Italy, where we also have some presence there. I think really. For me, it's not blurred at all, and it's of course part of the political discourse here, also on the island, on the islands, and of the opposition party to blame also the European. We are used to get blame. I mean, it's not that is not the problem, but we have not decided, for example, on the location of the new camp, which is also one of the issues of big discussions on the island of Chios and also here. We have not obliged Greece to build a new camp, but this was a proposal to give money to not have any Morias in the future, because we explained also as European Commission that be realistic. We have seen between 2015 until now and until 2 years ago when the task force was created, we've seen the flows. We see how many people are in Turkey, how many people come, how many people are in other countries. We see the flows now even. So, I mean, it was reasonable to say, please do something to have reception centers which are adequate and able to receive up to a certain number of people on these 5 hotspot islands, which they are not called anymore, because we don't. The hotspot approach is not the one we are pursuing anymore. So it was a thing of the past, and that's why some of the analysis, I would say, is applying to things that have already changed now. But the blurring is not a fact. I mean, the blurring is put forward by some in the narrative to say, yeah, but look, this is the Commission building. The Commission is pushing us. It's also used as an excuse.
Do you accept, Franz, that the Commission's role is growing? Anna talks about Europeanization. Do you at least accept that the European Commission's role is changing and growing?
Europeanization is a word that I would very much like to use, because for any context, because I think, and also in the context with Ukraine, we realize more and more that there needs to be a European approach to our problems, because one member state alone cannot go alone in migration and in many other things. So Europeanization, yes, but always on the basis of the legislation that we have. We do not invent new legislation, or we do not give Greece as a task force, for example, or as DG Home, even not Ylva Johansson or Margaritis Chinas. We do not give exemptions or exemptions to the Greeks. That's legislative proposals, but we should not confuse these two things.
Okay, Anna, real quick.
Yeah, very quickly. I just wanted to say, Franz, also because you mentioned that the Commission is not testing new policies on Lesvos, and I've talked about that in my research. I just want to say that, for example, Frontex's role on Lesvos as a border region was indeed enlarged, in terms of scope, in terms of personnel, and even like participation in the screening, of asylum applications and proceedings. So what I'm saying is that this modus operandi and this joint cooperation has been first applied on Lesvos and in some other border regions, and then, for example, used at the borders between Poland and Belarus. That's why Lesvos is considered by different interviewees as a blueprint for EU asylum policy.
I guess, Franz, it could be that that the intention wasn't to treat Lesvos as a testing ground or a laboratory, but in practice it became one because things which were tried there were then applied elsewhere, I think is the argument. No?
No, I'm sorry, because I mean the increase or the change or the extension of the role of Frontex is not limited to Lesbos. Frontex was put on a new footing with more own staff, which makes sense for a simple reason, because if you have only very short-term staff all the time, the quality of work on the spot suffers, and it's also difficult for people to get acquainted with a new situation, and then after 3 months they have to leave again. So this is one thing, and the other thing is we're not testing policies here. Maybe the member states applies the policy in one way or another. Of course, that's always the case. I mean, we don't have we have directives, and directives need to be implemented, so national law adapts and changes and so on. But the Commission, I mean, we do not test the policy, and for Frontex, I mean, sorry to say that, but it's not. They are not involved in the screening of applications at all. Frontex is involved in the registration process as part of providing staff to be able to deal with the numbers. But they are not doing border control, and they're not doing any screening of applications. Neither are EUAA people, even if they are embedded, but they're not involved in decisions. Asylum decisions are always taken by the member state.
Okay, Professor Duvček, you wanted to add a very quick word on Frontex.
Yeah, because I think so. The role of Frontex is very
which is based in Warsaw, right? So
yes, it's based in Warsaw. But this is if we speak about the Frontex, we should also take into account, for example, the position of Polish government, who decided not to invite Frontex to solve the problem of to help to solve the problem on the Polish-Belarusian border. It means, for example, it was, of course, these are the part of the anti-European rhetoric from the Polish government. But I tried to convince Mons to invite Frontex, because for me it was the absolute necessary to provide Europeanization of this problem, and also try to convince other member states it is not only our problems in our very strong relation with Lukashenko and Belarus, but it's also the pan-European problem. But still, Polish government, what is the rhetoric from Polish government? We don't need Frontex because then the Frontex doesn't have any border guards. On the one hand, it's not true. But on the other hand, it is not the role. It is not the role of the Frontex to save the borders. It's absolutely another role. But still, if we have the Frontex, we should of course involve them for solving the problems of the borders. But if the governments don't, for example, the Polish government doesn't want it, it is stuck to the problem. What is the role of the Frontex? Thank you.
very interesting on the relationship between the government in Poland and Frontex. Catherine, I want to bring you in on this question of the politics of this, because there've been a few questions in the Q&A about, and then this is something that's already come up in our discussion, about the growth of the far right in Europe and the effect that that's having on our debates about this. We talked about the media, but also on policy itself. So there was a very specific question about how you see the Meloni government changing Italian policy in practice as opposed to just their rhetoric. And then there's another question about this way in which there seems to be an increasing sort of echo of right-wing populist rhetoric around these questions. And again, this already came up. This idea that since 2019, the centre-right has been increasingly mimicking, I suppose, far-right rhetoric and policy on these questions. Tell us more about how you see that, the role of the far right.
Yes. Thank you. And I think this is an issue that's often overstated. I mean, if we look at the far right, unfortunately, those parties have always been part of the European political landscape. There were far right parties in post-war Germany. I mean, in many countries, despite these recent crises on this issue, the voting share of these parties has been stable or declining. It comes and goes. So I think having as a sort of default, there is the far right, therefore we have to do these terrible things, is a particularly weak argument.
So you don't actually accept, Catherine, that the far right has become stronger in Europe over the last decade?
I refer to academic evidence that shows in many European countries, their voting share is stable or declining. In other countries, it's rising. In some countries, it rises and then it falls again.
But we've certainly had during the last decade more far-right governments emerging, either as a junior coalition partner or as a senior coalition partner, than I think was ever the case.
Right.
Surely.
So then let me make my second point, which is so much depends on the strategy of other parties towards the far right.
Yeah.
So does the cordon sanitaire hold? Are other parties willing to go into coalition government with the far right? It is one issue. And do other parties in the centre decide on a self-defeating strategy of absorbing the perspectives and policies of the far right? There was certainly a period where the centre left was had the tendency to incorporate policies of the far right, and actually in many cases this led them to lose votes rather than to gain votes.
Danish Social Democrats, I guess, are a striking example. In fact,
although interestingly, look at the most recent election in Denmark, the issue was hardly on the agenda, and the argument is being made that the period of popularity of those politics is declining in Denmark. So I think, and I mean, let's also look at the fact that the policies that Social Democrats have put in place are not working in Denmark. I mean, despite the massive amount of resources and attention they've put on their Rwanda deal, they haven't achieved anything with it.
I wasn't suggesting they're working. I was just saying it's striking that you have in theory a centre-left party that has asylum policies that you would associate possibly with the far right, certainly with the centre-right.
But then I think the comparative analysis of all centre-left parties shows that in most cases they lose votes by absorbing those policies. I mean, in Slovakia, they lost 10%. I mean, and this is the case in many countries. So and that's not to downplay the terribly negative and destructive effect of these parties. It's to actually analyse what success or otherwise they're having, and then what responses make sense. I think the other issue to take into account is the fragmentation in party political systems across a lot of Europe. And that means that a party could be the largest party with 15% of the vote. So the far right, if the far right is getting 7-10%, that may make them a contender in a fragmented political system. If you look at European political systems in the immediate post-war period, you had two big blocs getting 30, even 40, 50% of the votes. Now you have a situation where there may be 10 or more parties with smaller percentages. Within that, the far right. And if we look at things like Alternative for Deutschland, for instance, there was rightly concern about their votes, but 15%, that means there's 85% who didn't vote for them. So I think that there needs to be the proper perspective on those parties, and then the proper strategies in response to them. And I would add to this that responsible political leadership in terms of how this issue is discussed is extremely important. So the crisis framing I mentioned before, there's also a whole lot of unhelpful rhetoric about who people are, why they come, refugees, and so on, but also misrepresentation of statistics, which can play into some of these more restrictive policies. So for instance, parties and political leaders that may actually want to defend the rights of refugees, but then go down the road of saying, well, the vast majority of people arriving in Europe do not have protection needs. That's not actually true. We hear it all the time. In fact, it's the majority of people who are arriving do have protection needs if you look at first instance and second instance decision making, with 30% granted at second instance. And actually protection rates are historically quite high. So there's all kinds of things that are more subtle that also consolidate an anti-asylum approach.
I think it's clear it's very sort of complicated, but what about this specific question then about the Meloni government? Will it change Italian policy and by extension EU policy in practice?
No, no, I don't think so. The question, of course, with Italy, we've already been there in 2018 when Salvini was interior minister, and that led to a huge amount of disruption and changes in Italian law, some of which have been implemented, some haven't. With the Meloni government, of course, she herself has tried to present a more responsible, more European and constructive approach. And that's primarily because Italy is waiting for billions of euro of COVID money to come into the country as negotiated by her predecessor. So this Italian government seeks to gain the credit for that money coming in. They've tried to contain this issue to be only about Mediterranean disembarkation questions. But I think they have underestimated the extent to which that issue then rapidly escalates to the European level. And this is what we saw with this recent conflict with France when Italy refused to allow rescue ships to disembark. By not allowing Salvini to have the Interior Ministry portfolio, that was an attempt to contain this problem. But you actually have 3 ministers in Italy which are competing to cause disruption on the search and rescue and the disembarkation issue. In that sense, that can be managed by a collective approach to both relocation, but also to disembarkation. Because currently, for various reasons, Italy is taking the largest responsibility when it comes to ships docking. So there are ways out of that can be discussed. Finally, I think the question is, will this Italian government blow up a potential deal on the pact? Now, the full pact can't be passed because there's only a year and a half. So what is possible is a partial reform. And the French brokered deal is one possibility. It's not a particularly good deal for the Italians because the solidarity mechanism is a weaker piece than accepting the screening regulation and Eurodac. However, we would think that Italy is likely to maintain its support for it because of other non-migration related factors, and specifically the funding that presumably is behind their agreement to that deal that the French brokered in the first place.
Thanks, Catherine. So, Professor Dubček, there's a little bit of a parallel with Poland here as well, isn't there? In the sense that we're having this debate now about whether it's right to even call the Meloni government a far-right government in a somewhat analogous way to the debate about how to think about the Polish government. Is it a far-right government? Is it a national conservative government, and so on? But isn't there, it strikes me there is a bit of a sort of, there's something quite odd here, which is that apparently our source of hope on this question of EU asylum policy is the possibility of a new approach, which is being led by, whether you call it a far-right government or a national conservative government in Poland. That's a slightly odd kind of situation. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. But also there's a question from the audience about, we've talked about the distinction between different types of refugees from different parts of the world, and this question of ethnic solidarity. But Tom here, raises the question of, what about the distinction between legal and illegal migrants? Is that not also a quite crucial distinction?
So next year we will have the election in Poland, of course, and that I don't think so. That this issue will be very, very deeply discussed within the election campaign, because I think that in the previous campaign this issue was very, very deeply discussed within the politicians, and it was in the media, as I said, it was the picture where pictured especially by the public media and by the government, that we are on the threat. What I mentioned already, what I have mentioned already. But I don't expect that the position of the Polish government will be changed in the short period of time.
You mean
because,
even if there's a civic platform government, the policy will be roughly the same?
No. That I'm speaking about the next year. This is the question about, of course, if the opposition will win. It is the very good question. What would be the position of the new Polish government, which would be, for example, based on the current democratic opposition. But to be honest, I don't expect, for example, the change of the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border. No one will destroy the fence on the Polish-Belarusian border, because it would be unpopular in the Polish society. Because I think so that the 75% of Poles are very in favor on this building of this fence of the Polish-Belarusian border. That's why I don't think so that the opposition party will change this attitudes, this position towards the fence of the Polish-Belarusian border. But this is I think that still it is quite important discussion about the pushbacks, because, as I said, this is the Polish court decided. The Polish court decided that the pushbacks are illegal. It means that the Polish law is against that international law, which have been ratified by Poland. And for example, 3 weeks ago, the Polish border guards wrote the letter to the one of the newspaper that they are afraid what would be the situation, for example, in the future when they will be prosecuted by for example by the court for pushbacks. That's why I can say I think that in the near future we will have this discussion in Poland about the human rights, about how we should react on the provocation from the Lukashenko. What would be the role of the turnbacks to the borderline, because it is the official definition what border guards are doing now. It is not pushbacks, because this word is absolutely banned in Poland. This is the turnbacks to the line of the borderline, to the turnbacks to the borderline. It is the official definition. Also, this definition is this Polish law. That's why I expect this discussion in the future, but I don't think that it would be the very strong discussion in the next election campaign. Because on the one hand, the Law and Justice will be not interested in, but also the opposition will be not interested in to highlight this issue in the election campaign.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Maybe Myers, very pure response.
And any last thoughts from you before I give Anna the last word?
Thank you. Yes, no, I just wanted to subscribe to much of what Maciej, but also Catherine said before. I think as I said before, I mean, we need to be realistic in general in our approach to that. But it's very, very important also that we get facts, that we get research. So I also thank Anna for her work and all the others who are doing a lot of very valuable work. Just one last word on this European way of life, because I think you triggered me a bit with that. I think many people found it a bit strange as a title for a commission or for a portfolio. On the other way, I think, on the other hand, I think there is also a positive way of looking at it, because part of the European way of life is precisely that we give asylum and protection to a lot of people. I think we are the world region who does this most, and not only that, for many other things. I think we can be proud of being an open and democratic society, having these values that we have. But we have to fight every single day to implement that. There's a lot of hybrid attempts also to bring us on different ways. I mean, the far right and the populistic right have been mentioned already. So I think there are a lot of things that we can be proud of, and that people come to us precisely because of that, because there is this European way of life, which is not a kind of fortress Europe approach, I would say.
I know that's the way a lot of Europeans think. I think we could have a longer debate about whether that's the case in reality. But anyway, Anna, last word to you. There was a couple of quite specific questions that you might want to answer about where the European Union Asylum Agency fits into the picture. And that's very much in Anna's long piece. So Philip, who asked that question, do go and read her piece on exactly that question. And any other thoughts you had, Anna, before we wrap up?
Thank you. No, it's been a very, very interesting debate. I first wanted to talk briefly about the importance of legal pathways that Franz mentioned, and Catherine also highlighted. Definitely, there's no one that would disagree with the ability of asylum seekers to come through safe pathways, but at the same time, these legal pathways do not exist in practice. They're very limited. So that's why people, either refugees or migrants, that this has to be decided later on according to EU and international law, make the dangerous journey to Europe. So that's a very important, realistic comment to make. Of course, the rhetoric about safe pathways is fantastic, but what happens in practice is very different. Secondly, I wanted to totally agree with Professor Ducek's comments about the reality of domestic politics, and that the Polish government's approach towards migrants and refugees coming from Belarus is not going to change. But this also raises an important, an important point on the influence of domestic politics on the European agenda. So on the one hand, we talked about how member states are in control and they're reclaiming, let's say, border control because of, domestic considerations and politics. At the same time, we've seen the EU Commissioner, for migration, Mrs. Johansson, or even the President of the European Commission, adopting this rhetoric of hybrid war against the EU, or illegal migration, or judging, let's say, from the outset without giving the possibility to these people to enter EU territory and benefit from the asylum system, which is already in place, judging them from the outset as, a group of people that want to invade or be used to harm the EU. So I think this is problematic. Indeed, there is the domestic political context, but the way it's being endorsed or amplified by the Commission and other European institutions is a bit problematic. And last, yes, I want to say that, of course, there's been lots of developments, and some of them have been very positive, operational. For example, Greece could not have responded to the arrivals in 2015-16, and from then onwards, without the support of other European countries and the institutions, of course. But at the same time, and as one of the questions highlighted about the European Asylum Agency, there's been an overstepping in the competences. And this has been, for example, concluded by the European Ombudsman in different decisions, and then has been remedied by subsequent legislation. So definitely this is a very complex terrain, and there's a lot to discuss about who does what in which order, but and it's still evolving. But this is what creates this blurring of boundaries and responsibilities in this field of asylum. Thanks.
I think that's a great note to end on, Anna. I guess the conclusion is not quite a breakthrough, but also not a dead end. And I think in a way that sort of reflects the fact that we've had a really nice, I think, discussion with, very different perspectives, from a Commission perspective, academic perspective, an NGO perspective, and so on. But we've managed, I think, to bridge some of those different perspectives quite well. Do read Anna's long piece. It's really, really good. And we look forward to seeing you again for another discussion soon. Anna, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just saw, if I may abuse the time for 1 minute, I saw this very interesting question, which happens to me all the time as well, here from friends and relatives, that everyone wants to come to Europe, and what's going to happen? I think this is really a very, a very interesting point. How do we respond to such fear? And I want to say that evidence suggests that 80% of the world's refugees reside outside of Europe. And if we see the number of arrivals in 2022, for example, they're just above 140,000 compared to the 450 million of people residing in the EU. So, if you compare the numbers, you can see that there's no real danger of an invasion into Europe. This is created. This is a political narrative.
And I think that does slightly challenge the idea of Europe being the most sort of generous bloc in terms of refugees. But that, I think, is a discussion we're going to have to pick up another time. We've already slightly overrun. Thank you all so much, the four of you, for the discussion. And thank you to everybody that joined for the discussion and stayed to the end. And we hope to see you again soon.